Well, thank you very much, Dr. Helen, and it's nice meeting you here online. Actually, I was looking at your blog, and I found some interesting books about methods, and it is also very fascinating that how you deal with uh, teaching quantitative researchers how to do qualitative research. It was very interesting because most of the people I know, they are doing quantitative research, but they are eager to do qualitative research. But we will begin with your introduction in your own words, please.
Well, it's lovely to meet you too, Asher, and I'm very happy to be here. I've been an independent researcher for 23 years and an independent scholar for 11 years now. I've never been an academic, as in employed by a university, but I do scholarly work and academic type research, as well as commissioned research. And I specialize in research methods and research ethics. My first degree was in the early 1980s and was purely quantitative. I studied social psychology, and it was 100% quantitative research all the way through. Then I was employed for some years in different jobs. And when I became an independent researcher, I found I was doing more mixed methods, evaluation type research to begin with. And I thought I'd better skill up, improve my skills. And I went and did a master's degree in social research methods and discovered I loved the topic, did a PhD after that. And I've never looked back since.
Great. And what about your blog? When did you think about writing a blog?
Well, oddly enough, I have been keeping a blog most of the time since about 2005. But to begin with, it was on a different topic. It was more, blogs in the 2000s were more sort of autobiographical. They weren't so much linked to work. I can't remember when I started this one, maybe 2014, when it became more common. It was becoming more common for people doing academic and research type work to have blogs that were related to their work. And I thought, well, I've done blogging and I liked it, and I'm doing this kind of work and I like it, so let's put the two together. My blog doesn't have a massive following, especially considering how long it's been going, but it has a big readership, and articles get picked up by LSE Impact Blog, I think there's been stuff in the Times Higher Educational Supplement. I can't remember, but sometimes they get picked up, and I get messages saying, "Can we republish?" Which is nice. And of course, I tweet the links and put them on social media and so on, and that brings new readers every time.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, to break the ice, I will begin with this word methodologist, because somehow, most of the people may be not well aware of this word methodologist. It looks like that methodology is becoming a kind of specialized field in social research. So what is your stand on this becoming a methodologist?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I think people have different understandings of the word methodology and how it applies to research methods. My own conceptualization of that is that a methodology is an overarching framework. So you might use a positivist methodology, or a participatory methodology, or a constructivist methodology. And then the methods are the tools you use within that to get the research done. So you might use laboratory experiments within a positivist methodology. If you're using a more constructivist methodology, you might do interviewing, something perhaps more qualitative. So I don't really think of myself as a methodologist, because that's too linked to methodology, but all these terms are contested. The language around this topic is very slippery, especially when we start talking about things like creative research methods, which is more at the forefront of the way research is being done, or indigenous research methods, which is a very interesting, completely separate paradigm from the Euro-Western kind of research that I do and I think you do. So the words are difficult, but I also like demystifying. I do quite a lot of teaching, and I like to help people understand that although some of the language is a bit complicated, the concepts aren't that complex, actually. What we're doing is finding out things we didn't know before. It's that simple. Yeah. And in fact, research is a very normal human activity. We do it in our lives. Yeah. If we're going to buy something expensive, we'll compare different models. We'll ask our friends and families what they think. We'll look at reviews. All of this, that's research. That's absolutely research. And in fact, humans are not the only species on the planet who do research. There are some animals, elephants, sea otters, crows, rats, have all been seen to do trial and error experiments before deciding on a course of action. and so on. And it's interesting. It seems to be part of how this planet is made.
Yeah, I have realized during my, well, I am not that experienced yet, but anyhow, during my PhD from Norway and MPhil from Norway, I have realized that, and while teaching at the university, I just realized that sometimes the students who are doing masters or PhD, they just try to use the methodologies, already existing methodologies.
Mm.
They don't want to experiment something. So what do you think about this trend?
Well, I think that's an interesting point, because I know what you're saying. I think sometimes doing a master's or doing a PhD is big enough and scary enough and hard enough without also pushing the boundaries when it comes to the methods and the methodologies. But I also know, when I wrote my book on creative research methods, the second edition's out now, that came out in 2020, it's this one. And that was really a collation exercise. I just collected lots of examples from academic journals and chapters in books and so on, and brought them together. And a lot of those pieces were by doctoral students or postdoctoral students writing about their doctoral work. So some people in their doctoral study, and also to some extent in master's degrees, but it's more common at doctoral level, some people are taking the opportunity to push the methodological boundaries and to be more creative. They're not the only ones who do, of course, but I was surprised by how many. So I take your point that there's also a bigger number of many that don't do it, but there are definitely some who do.
Yeah, great. Okay, now very much connected to this thing, you have a book that you just showed, Creative Research Methods. So do you think that creative research method is about, it can train a researcher to invent some method or to discover some methods?
Yes, absolutely. Because all methods were invented or discovered by somebody sometime. And often people are surprised how recently methods that we regard as very well established were in fact invented. The questionnaire was invented in 1838. It's less than 200 years ago. Interviews were adopted from journalism by researchers just in the early 20th century, maybe a little over 100 years ago. Focus groups were only used for the first time towards the end of World War II to investigate the impact of propaganda. And so focus groups are, within not my lifetime, but within some living, within living memory of people on this earth. And yes, anyone can actually invent or discover a new research method or adapt an existing method in a new way. And if your research calls for that, then it's fine to do. I think where it's difficult is when people want to do that for its own sake. I think there needs to be some justification in terms of it being helpful, likely to be more helpful way of answering the question the person is trying to answer, rather than just being done for its own sake. But yeah, I can see why. And also a misconception about creative research methods is that simply means arts-based methods, which it does include, but there's also huge creativity going on using technology in research in all sorts of ways, and creativity in multimodal or mixed methods research, and other arenas too. So it's bigger. It's not just arts, paints, drawing, etc., although those are part of it.
Yeah, great. One question that just comes to my mind, whenever we talk about the new methodologies or creative or innovative methodologies, a big question is the validation. And usually we came across the reviewers who questions what is the validation of your methodology. So have you written something about the validation in your book, or some articles you have written about it?
Sorry, I'm not quite understanding what you're asking me here. Is this about when people say, how do you justify using this method?
Yeah, maybe in a way both things. For example, if somebody is using a new methodology, a reviewer can question that how will you validate your findings because you are using a new method. Yeah.
Okay, I'm with you now. Thank you for the clarification. With creative methods, there are reviewers and supervisors and examiners and government ministers and all sorts of people who will say that's not proper research. Proper research is done in laboratories, or at least using questionnaires. and everyone's entitled to their own viewpoints. But I disagree very fundamentally with that, which will not surprise you, I think. I think there are very different and interesting ways to explain the quality of the research that is done. And I'm not the only one. People cleverer than me have worked on this. There's a woman called Sarah Tracy. She's a professor in America. And she wrote a journal article, I think came out some years ago now, about 2010. And she set out 8 criteria for judging the quality of qualitative research. It's an excellent article. It's been cited thousands and thousands of times. I mean, it's very widely regarded as a really good way of benchmarking and checking through. Because for the positivist research, in my first degree, I was taught about reliability and validity and generalizability. And those attributes make perfect sense for positivist research, but they don't work for qualitative research. We need different attributes. So Sarah Tracy talks about things, I can't remember them all off the top of my head, but she talks about things like transparency and honesty and value and worth and resonance, these different kinds of criteria that we can use and apply. And, I think the people who think this isn't proper research will just die out, because younger people are very much more open to the idea of research being variable and to the idea of context being important for research. And the whole thing about replicability, I mean, of course, if you're doing lab research, then that makes sense to have that as an important criterion. But if you're doing real world research, you can never replicate a setting. If you do research again, it's at a different time, it's in a different school, or it's in a different hospital, or it's in a different prison. And you can't do the replication in the way that you can in the lab. You can replicate to an extent, you can say, does this method work? Does this finding apply? Does this, let's test this here and see if it works. And that's worth doing. But you can't isolate an experiment from all the potentially confounding variables in the same way. But we need real world research as much as we need lab research. It's not either or, we need both, we need all of it. Yeah. And I'm not suggesting creative methods should be used instead of. If you need to use a questionnaire as part of a survey, it's a terrific instrument in the right context. There's nothing wrong with it. I'm not arguing that we should put all those away, but I think we need to expand our methods toolbox, because we're coming up against more and more complex problems in society, in the world, and we need to find the solutions.
Yeah, it reminds me about Dr. Judith Hanyu. She was my supervisor, and she wrote about child-friendly research methods. And it just gives me an idea that why she was insisting that when you were doing a child research, you need more methods. So this, conventional method would not work for child research. Yeah.
I think that's absolutely, and that's where I came into it, because I did a lot of research with children and families. After I'd studied psychology, I worked as a social worker with young people for quite some time. So when I came into research, I did loads of work with children, and I've always used creative methods for that reason, because when you're working with children, you need to make it fun for them. Yeah. Otherwise, they're not interested, because that's how it is when you're a child. And I actually think we could try harder to make research fun for adults too, including researchers and participants. I don't see why research shouldn't be fun. I don't see why it always has to be super serious. Of course, it's the serious business in one sense. And of course, sometimes it's going to be serious. But when we can have fun, let's do that. It's not only children who learn through play, adults can as well.
Yeah. And yes, of course, not only for children, but maybe for the marginalized people who are not good enough in conventional questionnaire and interviews. And you need more methods to connect them with the data.
You do, and to recognize their expertise, because everyone is an expert in something. Yeah. We're not all experts in the same things, but everyone has expertise that they can bring to a research project that's of interest to them. And so I absolutely agree with you that we need creative ways to find that expertise and bring it in, and to make the arena more level. So it's not, oh, I'm an academic, I've written books, I'm the expert, and you're just other people. We're all experts. And that's important too.
Yeah, great. Now, a very important question, actually. You know that whatever I've seen, most of the students in psychology, they go for quantitative researches. And if I just remember back in Pakistan, most of the students, when they do quantitative searches, mostly we are using the scales, and sometimes they are translated and being validated, and then they use those scales. So you have written a book on qualitative research for quantitative researchers. So you think that quantitative research, exactly. So quantitative research for quantitative researchers. So number one, why do you think that this book is important? And number two, do you think that this book can break the barriers of the quantitative researchers' top-down approach to think something as a kind of bottom-up?
Number two, I certainly hope so. Question one, I was involved in some conversations online between researchers who were struggling because they'd come through a quantitative education and degree and probably PhD and work, and were now having to learn about qualitative research and finding it really difficult. Often it was because they needed to do some mixed methods work or to add a qualitative element to their quantitative work. Sometimes it was because they'd changed jobs and their new employer was more interested in qualitative research. And people were saying things like, I know where I am with p-values, but I don't understand what's all this about epistemology. And these kinds of questions. And because my first degree was quantitative, I really understood because when I studied social research methods and learned about qualitative research, it was hard for me to learn. I was interested, in fact, it blew my mind at times, but it was really hard. I found it really difficult to get my head around it. And I thought there must be a way. I was thinking about it, and I looked to see if there was a book that I could recommend, but there wasn't one. There was one on the other way around. There was one on quantitative research for qualitative researchers. So I thought, okay, so we need a book that's about qual for quant. I think I could write that. And I enjoyed writing it because it's for people who are already researchers. So I don't have to start from first principles and say, this is the basics of, why we do research and all that. And also I felt like I knew how to explain, for starting from where people already are as experienced quantitative researchers. And I tried to find examples of qualitative research from predominantly quantitative fields. I couldn't always, but often I could. And I thought that would be helpful because it would perhaps be easier for people to relate to. And it only came out in February. It's only been out for a couple of months, but the early feedback I've had has been good. So I think perhaps it will be useful for people. I hope so, because I spent a long time writing it.
Yeah, hopefully, yeah. And with your permission, I will also place your blog link in the description of the video so that people can access the blog and see your book work there. Okay, now my last question is, thank you very much. My last question is, actually it is related to whatever I am researching nowadays, but I just want to know your stand on it. I am working on social resilience and migration, and I am exploring the young adults' perspective and their social experience in Sweden. And I want to explore social resilience in the context of social experience with an assumption that our enhanced social experience may improve our social resilience. So what do you think that if someone like me who is researching social experience in the context of social resilience, how or what kind of qualitative research methods would be would be beneficial for this research?
Okay, well, there are lots, actually. This is one of the things with methods. There are loads of things you could choose from. So you could do interviews. That would be a very simple, straightforward method. Interviews are a great method. However, it does help if you have a fairly fluent language in common with your interviewees, which I guess you won't necessarily with this particular group. Because people have conducted research interviews using interpreters, but I think that adds an extra layer of complexity. Where it's really necessary, I can see the point. But I think there are other things you could consider. Arts-based methods. Collage has been used very effectively in this kind of context because collage is accessible for pretty much everyone. And you can either use collages where you move things around and take photographs and then move them some more and talk and photograph as you go, or you can do the sort of stuck down kind that is more like a fixed artwork. And it can be interesting to have something else to focus on because you're asking about people's experiences that at times may be quite difficult experiences. Some of the people you talk to will have had a very traumatic time getting to where they are. And as researchers, we don't want to upset participants if we can possibly help it. And having a collage to focus on can make it easier. You can say things through collage or other art methods, but I'm particularly hearing good things about collage at the minute for this kind of thing. And another one to maybe consider is a bit more complicated. It's called cultural probes, which sounds a bit horrible actually, but what it is just briefly, I mean, it's quite complex. What you do is you create a set or collection of items that a participant can respond to. So you might create a postcard with a particular question on the front that they can answer on the back. You might create a structured diary. You might suggest particular activities for them to do where they can use textiles or cooking or other craft forms. There's lots of information about this in the literature and some online also, including I think on YouTube. And then you give your set of things to your participant and say, here, this is for you, and please interact with it in whatever way you choose. You don't have to do all of the things. Please choose the ones that you want to do, and then we'll talk about it, you know, later on when you're done. And that can produce really rich, fascinating data. It's harder to analyze, but it can be done. It was devised by design researchers talking to people about I think when they first devised it was around the turn of the century. They were talking to people about aging, growing older in a specific community and how that was for them and what they would like to change and so on. And it worked really well, and it's spread out now from design through the social sciences into the humanities, the arts, and probably, for all I know, STEM subjects too. So that might be something else to consider. So that's just 3 options off the top of my head. But there are many others as well. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. I thought you were here, so I should just get a tip from you. You were talking about traumatic experience, and it reminds me one of your book that was about research ethics.
Yes.
Yeah, I forgot its title. I think it's
Research Ethics in the Real World.
Research ethics in the real. Exactly. Yeah, the same book. So, what is this book about? Just brief.
Briefly, I wrote this book for a couple of reasons. I got frustrated with the way that the research ethics literature treats research ethics, and indeed universities do, as if research ethics exists in its own little bubble, because I don't believe it does. I think research ethics interacts and is linked with political ethics, institutional ethics, professional ethics, disciplinary ethics, personal individual ethics. They all come into play. And I thought we need to recognize that. And I also got frustrated with institutional approaches to ethics, very much focusing on only participant welfare, data storage. Of course, those are important, but I think ethics is important at all stages of the research process. I think ethics is hugely important when we're doing literature reviews, when we're analyzing data, when we're disseminating our findings. So I wanted to write a book addressing those points. And I did a book proposal on that basis, and it was accepted. After review, I began to write. And then I went to a seminar led by 3 Indigenous researchers, Bagele Chilisa from Botswana, Helen Kara from New Zealand, and Deborah McGregor from Canada. And they absolutely blew my mind because they taught me about the Indigenous research paradigm and how it's separate from the Euro-Western research. In fact, it predates the Euro-Western research paradigm by tens of thousands of years. And they can trace this because they use oral history, not written history, as we do in the Euro-Western paradigm. And so I began to read about Indigenous research methods and Indigenous research ethics, and it's fascinating, and we can learn a lot. By we, I mean, Euro-Western, particularly white colonizer Euro-Western researchers, but generally everyone. And so I thought I need to change what I'm doing with this ethics book. I need to include this literature. I need to cite it. I need to acknowledge it, use it. I need to set these paradigms side by side, not to compare, not to say which is better. That's pointless. But to see what we can learn from looking at them both. And so I talked to my publisher, who luckily, Policy Press, they have a strong social justice ethos. And they really understood where I was coming from with this. And they said, yeah, but we'll need to do another proposal. I didn't write anything for a year. I was reading Indigenous methods literature. and doing another proposal and so on. And then I started work on the book again. It's the hardest book I've ever written, but I'm glad I wrote it. And
Great.
Yeah, it seems also to be being quite well used, which is nice.
Yeah, because I was, you have done a lot of work, but I was just selecting some work that actually, that was very much related to my work and qualitative research. And before saying goodbye, you have written something about digital world and qualitative research.
Have I? I've forgotten about that.
Yeah,
I must have written something somewhere.
It is qualitative and digital research in times of crisis.
Oh, yes. Yes, indeed, I have. I don't have that one to... Oh, yes, I do. Yes, I do have that one to hand as well. Now,
Yeah.
this I edited. I didn't write this book. I co-edited it with Su-Ming Koo, who is my colleague from the National University of Ireland.
Okay.
And why that came about was because, again, this is policy press. Early in the pandemic, around May, I think 2020, I wrote a blog post about methods that we might be able to use in a global pandemic, because I was just seeing everyone doing online interviews, and I thought, no, there's more we can use. Yes, okay, we've got big restrictions on movement and on what we can do, but actually there's more than this. So I wrote a blog post, I think, outlining 3 different methods, autoethnography, I can't remember what the others were. And my editor at the time used to read my blog, and she emailed me and she said, how do you feel about editing a collection? We want to do a quick ebook about what people are doing around the world, how different researchers are meeting this challenge. I thought, great idea. And I didn't want to do it on my own. So I asked Sue if she would work with me, and she said yes. And we put out a call saying we need to do this quickly. We gave just 2.5 weeks for people to respond to the call. And we had over 100 responses. We had a phenomenal number. So we ended up doing 3 ebooks very rapidly. They were produced, I think they were published in September that same year. We did it so fast, and all the writers were great because they really understood and they wrote quickly and they answered emails, and they were great. But we also did a print book that came out a year later, which is that one I just waved at you, which is not solely about the pandemic. It's about other, because when we put the call, we said, it doesn't have to only be pandemic. We're interested in other types of crisis too. But in the end, we did the ebooks about the pandemic, and then the print book has a wider kind of look at different crises and how researchers might work in times of disaster, in times of conflict, as well as in times of pandemic. So yeah, so that's been really interesting. But I can't take the credit for writing that book. I just edited it. The contributions are terrific. The chapters in it are great.
Yeah, but of course, when you were writing that blog, maybe at that time you did not have this idea on your mind.
No, I really didn't. I really did not. No.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Helen, and it is very nice to see you online.
Well, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure for me. Yeah,
thank you. And I will also post your blog link in the description of my video so that it can help several people who will visit my blog on my YouTube channel. And I am sure that your work is magnificent and it will help several people, especially the students who are doing PhDs and they're stuck in their research.
I hope it will, because I know how that feels and I like to help them when I can. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.